This is episode 14 of Art, Why I Stuck with a Junkie Jazz Man. In episode 13, Art and I began seriously recording his reminiscences for the book, Straight Life, and we were getting used to each other. Episode 14 begins with a section called Social Life, and then down below it says Anne and John. So here we go. Social Life, Anne and John. I've always been a sort of recluse. I grew up during the McCarthy era with parents who wanted to overthrow the United States government, so I was required to keep secrets. Paranoia was in the air. Nobody in the Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP, was building bombs or anything, but our little bust of Trotsky and all those revolutionary books and copies of The Militant lying around the house were absolutely not to be seen by outsiders. And the living room was often filled with groups of drinking, disputatious socialists. So when I was a kid, none of my little friends could come home with me. And since I was an only child, I got used to being by myself, and I learned to live in books. I managed to have only 2 friends in college, so I married one of them and dropped out. Later, I liked drugs and alcohol because I could comfortably be a version of myself with other people without crippling self-consciousness. Until I woke up, of course, the next morning when I was able to remember in mortifying detail what an ass I'd been. Sober, I've been socially inept and misanthropic, though better now with age. Another only child, Art was reclusive too. He was paranoid and was wary of visitors. The guest might be a snitch, and he'd known many. He was not a guy to just hang out away from home unless drugs were involved. He objected to my friends, my lifelong closest friends, my cousins, Evie and Mirandy, with whom I chatted daily on the phone, who came over now and then. I loved them, confided in them. I enjoyed their conversation, laughed at their jokes. Art was jealous of them. My objection to his friends, they gave him drugs. Art's pastimes were walking, reading the newspaper, and watching TV. He liked to have the news tediously humming from the radio all the time, but I wouldn't tolerate that. He was passionate about almost all sports, baseball, basketball, football, even tennis, and followed them avidly. Sports talk was the way he was able to comfortably, though superficially, communicate with other men, with strangers. Art's friendships with men were usually based on favors they did for him. With women, intimacy came easily, if briefly. If they seemed sympathetic, he'd talk at once about how he felt, his physical problems and psychic pain. They confided in him, too. He had an ear for emotional openness, even for men, and he'd be interested, fascinated. And he'd remember them, their details. But that didn't mean he'd want to see them. Art's only friends back then in Venice were Anne and John. When he wasn't lying on the bed or out walking, he was up the street drinking coffee out of a big plastic thermal mug at Anne and John's house. I first saw them one afternoon as I crossed the alley on my way to the bakery. They were doing obvious, surreptitious business with Art. That's not a joke. Art always looked guilty, but especially when he was guilty, trying to act cool. He attempted to introduce me to them, but I only grunted, believing, that they were the source of my problems with him. We lived in Venice for 4 years, and eventually Anne and John became my allies. They kept Art out of trouble and content with an extra dose of methadone a couple times a week. Once I made friends with them, they refused to indulge him in anything else. Back in the 50s, John had been a narc in the LAPD, one of whose snitches was the dope fiend Lennie Bruce. John had been impressed by how the junkies he busted talked about heroin, how he saw the same people over and over again, intelligent people ruining their lives. He told me he had to find out why. He did. Got hooked, got busted, and went to jail with people he'd sent up. That worked out okay for him. He'd been cool and everybody liked him, including Ann. Ann had been a big Art Pepper fan. She and a girlfriend followed him around in the old days, gave him money, and bailed him out of jail. She knew Art well, and I quoted her a lot in Straight Life. Ann was a junkie with a rare gift. She could function while kicking. If she couldn't get a fix, she kept on working. She'd been a bookkeeper and, for a time, personal assistant to a former movie star, Jennifer Jones, dealing with her correspondence, social calendar, etc. I never found out how Ann wound up literally living in a hole in Venice. Their little rented shack was down below the sidewalk in a dusty ditch. But I figured it must have had to do with love. She told me she met John when he busted her. While she was in jail, she thought about him. Eventually, they got together. Coincidentally, they lived right up the street from us in Venice, on welfare and on methadone maintenance, courtesy of the County of Los Angeles. They got high doses and sold the extra, plus some pills. Their two-room house had the kind of lighting dope fiends prefer. None. The windows were all heavily draped, and the place had the humid stench of rooms slept in and always closed. And it stank of dog. It was filled with stray animals, 4 German shepherds and a couple cats. Ann and John had big hearts, but their front yard was only 5 feet deep by 10 feet wide and inadequately fenced, so the dogs remained in the house, perennially agitated, fenced off in the kitchen whenever they had guests. All conversations were interrupted by barking and shouts to the dogs to shut up. The front room was stuffed with a bed, a lawn chair, a coffee table, and TV. Art and Ann and I, when I visited, sat on the bed. John, chubby, pale, sweating, bespectacled, bearded, sat on the chair in a gray dashiki with blue rickrack at neck and sleeves. Ann had made him several. Art visited and sat with them for hours every day. In their right hands, they all held cigarettes. In their left, their bottomless hot coffees. They told stories about junkies they knew or knew of. It's a small world. And speculated by the hour about what was going on in the news, often getting the stories wrong in some essential details, so that what was undoubtedly already corrupted by the media as to accuracy became totally distorted in their nevertheless energetic and heated discussions. For me, it was Alice's tea party, with these 3 arguing the fine points of events that hadn't exactly happened, speculating about government policies that might have been enacted, scientific discoveries that were rumored to be on the brink of being made. Too bad for Art. John hated sports. I knew how good these people were, especially Ann. I truly liked and trusted them both, and I knew Art was safe with them. Better with them than scouting around, looking for trouble with his less settled friends who had a way of dropping by and getting my cold shoulder, like Bennie Burkoff. Bennie. Art knew Bennie from the joint and Synanon. He was a lumbering, dead-eyed, subverbal giant, black-haired, white-skinned, frightening to contemplate. It was Bennie who'd called Art up and persuaded him to leave Synanon. His scene, as Art described it to me later, was a junkie hell, a shooting gallery. I berated Art for days after I came home one afternoon to find him entertaining this character in our house. And Art didn't even try to pretend he didn't know what I was talking about. He apologized. Bennie's ultimate fate seemed to me poetic. He overdosed sitting on a toilet. When they found him, he was still alive, but his butt was gangrenous from lack of blood. He must have weighed 400 pounds, and his ass cheeks had to be removed. He died a few years later. At the time, I saw this bad end Bennie came to as a cautionary tale for Art, but I made no comment on it. I knew any pontificating or jokes from me would only divert Art's attention from the real story, which was gruesome enough on its own. No story would have made Art change his ways. Art was the son of two violent alcoholics. He was born with rickets and jaundice and missing a nervous system that could calm down. He was taught really early, at 7 or 8, to take medicine, phenobarbital, for relief from chronic nightmares, chronic fears. Maybe he could have been helped with love to deal with his terrors, but there was not enough of any useful kind of love. It happened that he was born with genius, too, and a taste for sensation, an eye and an ear for beauty. And his responses were so childlike, so full of awe, that what he felt could overcome you, too, if you were with him, listening to music, seeing something lovely. His appreciation, weak word, when it happened, rarely, was so infectious it nearly burst your heart and gave you a sense of how intense his feelings about anything always were, how delightful he was, what fun he was at his good times. Emotionally, he was superhuman. I thought I felt that when I touched him, a constant heated humming underneath his skin, a motor or a current. He was magnetic. And no one was more ardently drawn to him than Gus. Gus was a big, white, soft, blubbery alcoholic. He fastened on to Art early, wrote to him loyally during all Art's times, quote, away. He was Art's only consistent friend and would do anything for him. During the 60s, he'd brought his wife on visiting days to a medium security prison Art was in, Tehachapi, and instructed her to let Art feel her up behind a shed. Gus worked in hospitals in some capacity and steadily stole a whole rainbow of pills for him. Early on, I declared war against Gus. I had begged him not to give Art any drugs. He replied logically that if he didn't give him drugs, Art wouldn't talk to him. I said nastily that in that case, I'd examine the nature of their relationship. That was pointless sarcasm. He had examined it. He didn't care. So I closed my mind completely against any claims he had on Art and did everything I could to keep him out of our lives. But he was persistent. He'd watch the house for days if necessary, waiting for me to leave. Later, when Art began to work again, Gus turned up in every local nightclub, overwhelming Art with drinks and drugs. Out of love, and I thought envy, Gus actually seemed to be trying to obliterate Art with his offerings. He also spurred Art on to aggravation or to anger by gossiping to him about what other musicians he knew and managed to hang out with had snidely said about Art, wisecracks and put downs. I fantasized hiring a hitman. Art felt sorry for him and grateful for his loyalty through the years. Bennie died. Anne and John moved away to the country with their dogs. Gus was always with us. If anything makes me glad that that part of my life is over, it's the absence of the inevitable, ubiquitous hangdog, goddamned Gus.